I need a Tier 1 sniper now. The sound of Major General Ward's palm striking the briefing table echoed against the corrugated metal walls of the High Desert Joint Readiness Center. It was a sharp, biting noise that cut through the low hum of the ventilation fans and the scent of stagnant desert heat trapped in the room. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the concrete floor. That happened 14 months ago, but the memory was still as vivid as the dust currently coating the base. My father, Lieutenant General Everett Quinn, leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, condescending smirk spreading across his face as he looked at me. "Sit down, Mara," he laughed, the sound dry and hollow. "You've never been anything." I ignored him. My hands were steady, though the skin across my knuckles felt tight, and my uniform felt heavier than it had a moment ago. I didn't glance at Nolan, my brother, who sat 2 chairs away with his eyes fixed on his own hands. Ward ignored Everett entirely, his gaze locked onto mine. He didn't see a daughter, or a disappointment, or a family drama. He saw a solution to a safety stop that had paralyzed his entire validation exercise. "Call sign?" Ward asked, his voice low. "Ghost 13, I said. The air in the room didn't just still, it vanished. Every officer at that table froze, their movements halted mid-reach for a tablet or a pen. I saw the operations officer shift, his face tightening as he clearly remembered the redacted lessons learned package that had circulated through the senior staff weeks earlier. Everett's smirk didn't disappear, but it shifted, turning into a rigid, porcelain mask. He didn't understand the full scope of my life, he never had, but he understood the sudden, absolute silence of the men around him. He realized that the daughter he had spent decades defining as nothing was a ghost who had walked through rooms he could never enter. Ward didn't congratulate me. He didn't salute. He simply pointed toward the range status board. "The lane is yours. Fix the assessment. Nothing more." I left the briefing room without acknowledging my father. The walk to the range was a blur of sun-scorched asphalt and the metallic tang of dry wind. Nolan trailed behind, his pace uneven. Once we were out of earshot, the facade he'd been curating since he pinned on his captain's bars began to fracture. "You're doing this on purpose," Nolan hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and genuine fear. "You've waited years to make me look small." "I'm doing this because your team missed a ballistic verification after a barrel swap, Nolan," I said, stopping to face him. The wind whipped his hair across his eyes, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. "If that round had been sent downrange, you wouldn't be worried about how small you look. You'd be worried about the inquiry that follows a fatality." "It's a paperwork error," he insisted, his jaw working. "Just sign off on the supplementary page and let it go. Dad is already on site. He's expecting this to be cleared by sunset." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was looking at the ballistic data card he'd handed me. The numbers were wrong. They were off by enough to turn a precision shot into a disaster. I looked at Nolan, seeing the golden boy that our family had poured their entire identity into, and for the first time I didn't see a brother I needed to save. I saw a man who had decided that his convenience was worth more than the lives of the soldiers under his command. When we reached the lane, the safety personnel were standing by, their faces neutral. Ward was already there, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the target array. "The data is invalid," I told him, bypassing the pleasantries. I handed the card to the lead safety officer. "They didn't re-zero after the maintenance. The wind call they're using is based on a calculation from 6 months ago." Everett appeared behind us, his presence like a sudden drop in pressure. He looked at the range board, then at me, then at the safety officer. "Is there a problem, Sergeant Quinn?" "Major Quinn's unit is not compliant with safety standards, General," I said, refusing to use his title as a shield. "The validation cannot proceed." Everett stepped closer, his voice dropping to that familiar, terrifying register, the one he used to demand absolute obedience. "We've had a long day, Mara. Nolan has been under a lot of pressure. I'm sure a minor correction is all that's required. The standard doesn't change based on the date or the name on the packet, I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. It's not cleared. Everett's eyes flashed. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply turned to the officer in charge of the range. Take 5 minutes to review the paperwork with Captain Quinn. I'm sure he has the necessary documentation. He looked at me one last time, a look of profound, chilling dismissal. It was the same look he'd given me at every family dinner, every graduation, every milestone where I had stood in the shadow of his expectations. He thought I would fold. He thought that by putting the weight of his rank in the room, he could make me disappear. But I was already gone. I hadn't been Mara Quinn, the disappointment, for a very long time. I was Ghost 13, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just observing the standard, I was holding it. And this time, I wasn't going to let go. 72 hours before the command briefing room fell into that suffocating silence, I was standing in my kitchen, pressing coffee beans into the grinder, with a rhythm that had become my only morning meditation. The townhouse was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that took me years to afford, a space that didn't echo with the sharp, unpredictable tone of my father's authority. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting long, dusty fingers across the hardwood floor I'd finished staining just 2 weeks before. My phone vibrated against the granite countertop. Mara? Denise's voice was warm, grounded, the sound of a woman who had seen enough of the world to stop worrying about the small stuff. Good morning, I said, leaning against the counter. I hope you're ready to face the music tonight, Denise said, a teasing lilt in her tone. The general is observing the exercise. Your mother is expecting you at the guest house at 6. I stared at the rosemary plant Denise had given me for my last birthday. It was thriving. I'll be there for an hour. I'm driving myself, and I'm not staying the night. You're a grown woman, Mara. You don't have to keep doing this dance, she said. I know, I replied. But the dance was a habit, and habits were hard to break when they were tied to the only family I had left. After I hung up, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my mother. I watched the screen for a moment, letting it pulse, before answering. Mara, thank God. I've been trying your keypad for 10 minutes. Why isn't it working? Evelyn's voice was tight, thin with that familiar, fraying edge of artificial distress. I took a breath, letting the steam from the fresh coffee drift past my face. I changed the code, Mom. I told you last week that I needed more privacy. Privacy? She let out a laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. I am your mother. Privacy is for people who have secrets, not for a family. You need to come over here and show me how to get in. Your brother is in a state, and he needs your help with his gear. I'm not coming over to open the door, and I'm not helping with his gear, I said. The words felt heavy, but they landed with a clarity I hadn't possessed a year ago. I set the cup down. I have my own work, and Nolan has his own team. You are always so cold, Evelyn whispered. Your father sees it. He worries about you. He thinks you're drifting. I didn't answer. I reached into the drawer, pulled out my leather-bound notebook, and carefully recorded the time, the date, and the specific request she'd made. My therapist had told me once that the truth didn't need to be defended if it was documented. I wasn't collecting evidence to hurt them. I was collecting evidence to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. By the time I reached the standardization cell, the air in the high desert was already beginning to shimmer with heat. My supervisor, a man who valued precision over politics, dropped a stack of files on my desk. Assessment for the precision, marksmanship element, he said, not looking up from his computer. Due by end of play tomorrow. I nodded and began the review. The files were standardized, clean, and straightforward until I reached the tactical readiness packet. It was a mess. A company's readiness packet was a map of their integrity, and this one was riddled with gaps. Safety plans were missing signatures. Ballistic verification logs were incomplete. Chain of cross-check requirements had been completely ignored. I picked up my pen, marking each deficiency with a precise red stroke. I didn't know whose packet it was, yet the identity page was at the back, intentionally shielded until the review reached the conflict of interest phase. That was standard procedure for a joint center. When I finally reached the identity page and flipped it over, my stomach dropped not out of fear, but out of a sudden, crystalline understanding of the fight I was about to be in. The name on the unit commander line was Nolan Quinn. I sat in the silence of my office, the hum of the server room audible through the wall. My hand hovered over the internal communications button. I had a choice. I could call Nolan. I could try to steer him toward the fix. But that was the dance. That was the thing I'd been doing for 20 years. The thing that had kept me in the shadows while he stood in the light. I walked down the hall to my supervisor's office. "I have a conflict," I said, holding out the packet. "It's my brother's unit." He looked at the name, sighed, and then nodded. "Good catch. File the recusal memo. I'll reassign the assessment to the secondary team." I walked back to my desk, opened the official records, and drafted the recusal memo. I saved it, clicked the send button, and watched the status bar hit 100%. It was the cleanest action I'd taken all day. I didn't know then that the secondary team would be the ones to flag the unit as not mission ready, and I certainly didn't know that my decision to pull away would be seen as the ultimate betrayal. 2 days later, the 2 independent evaluators returned their findings. Both concluded the unit was not mission ready. The documentation was objective. The failures were structural. The decision was final. I was at my desk organizing my equipment for a field trip when the first call came in. "Mara," Nolan said. His voice wasn't the voice of a commander. It was the voice of the little boy who used to break things and wait for me to glue them back together. "You need to fix this." "I'm recused, Nolan," I said, keeping my tone level. "I didn't make the call. 2 separate teams did." "You didn't have to highlight those errors in the preliminary review," he shot back, his voice rising. "You knew it was me. You could have just made a phone call to the evaluator and asked them to look at the plan with a softer eye." "The safety of your soldiers isn't a soft eye issue," I said. "It's a verification issue." "Dad wants to speak to you," Nolan said, and the shift in his tone was immediate. It became colder, more distant, more threatening. "And he's not happy. You're making his job difficult. You're making all of us look like we can't handle our own." "I'm not making anyone look like anything," I said. The packet spoke for itself. "Is that so?" My father's voice replaced Nolan's. It was the voice that had presided over decades of military ceremonies, commanding the air around him. "A general has sacrificed his entire life for your stability, Mara. He has opened doors for you that you never even knew were locked. And now, you're standing in the way of your own blood because you can't be bothered to understand the reality of command?" "I understand command, Father," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though it felt like a shout in the small office. "I understand that a command is not a favor you do for family. It's a responsibility you carry for the people who trust you." "You are hiding behind procedure," he snapped, his voice tight with a rage that wasn't about the packet. It was about control. "You are using your rank to settle a private grudge. I suggest you get down here and make it clear to these evaluators that this is a simple misunderstanding." "I'm not going to do that," I said. My mother's voice came through next, distant, weeping. "Mara, please. Your father's blood pressure is spiking. You know what the doctor said about the stress. We're all we have. Why are you trying to destroy your own brother?" I closed my eyes. The guilt was there, a familiar, stinging weight, but it was being eclipsed by something else, a hardening of resolve. I had spent my life as their soft place to land. I had spent my life as their eraser. "I'm not destroying anyone," I said. "I'm holding the door open, but you're the ones who have to walk through it. I'm not doing anything more." I hung up the phone. I opened my notebook. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the names. Then I opened my email and sent an official summary of the conversation to the ethics board, explicitly stating that I would not be seeking special treatment for the unit in question, and that all future communications would need to go through official, recorded channels. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of survival. The next morning, I arrived at the standardization cell to find the air thick with tension. My supervisor pulled me into the hallway. "Mara, you've got a complaint filed against you. An anonymous one." "On what grounds?" I asked, my heart doing that slow, methodical drumbeat of someone preparing for a siege. "Professional misconduct. Claims you're hiding behind procedure to punish a family member," he said, his face unreadable. The words felt like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch. I knew where they came from. Those were the exact words my father had used on the phone. "I have my recusal memo on file," I said. "I have the routing receipt. I have the email I sent yesterday documenting the pressure they placed on me to influence the evaluator." He sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "I believe you, but you know how this works. Once a complaint is in the system, it has to be looked at, and in the meantime, the personnel office has called. They've asked for an administrative hold on your assignment to the new training center. You're under reconsideration." I went back to my desk and looked at the personnel portal. There it was, a small gray box where my future was supposed to be. It said, "Pending conduct review." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat there, in the quiet of the office I'd built with my own 2 hands, and I realized that my father had finally shown his hand. He didn't want to talk. He wanted to win. He didn't know that I had already changed the locks. He didn't know that I'd already cleared my name from the trust that had once tied me to his legacy. He thought he could pull the rug out from under me, but he hadn't realized that I had already learned to stand on the floor. I pulled up the screen again. The office code for the action was from headquarters, the building where my father sat in an office lined with awards, surrounded by aides who lived to do his bidding. I couldn't see his face, but I could hear his voice in my mind. He was betting on my fear. He was betting that I would rather lose my position, my reputation, and my integrity than endure the sight of his disappointment. He was wrong. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hyper-focused clarity. I didn't try to call anyone. I didn't try to explain myself to the colleagues who were already glancing at me with guarded eyes. I simply began to organize my records. I logged every interaction, every time-stamped message, every official document that proved my compliance. That evening, I didn't go to the guest house. I drove home, to the townhouse that was entirely, legally, and beautifully mine. I turned the deadbolt. I listened to the silence. It wasn't the lonely silence of a woman being punished. It was the quiet of a life reclaimed. Denise came over later with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. She looked at the laptop screen, then at me. "They're going to come for you, aren't they?" "They're already here," I said, taking a sip of the wine. It tasted sharp, grounding. "But they're fighting a war on their terms, and they've already lost." "How can you be so sure?" she asked. "Because they still think the goal is to keep them happy," I said, looking out the window toward the desert, where the stars were beginning to burn with cold, distant fire. "They don't realize I've stopped caring what they think." I didn't know then that the hold on my assignment was only the beginning. I didn't know that Major Blake was already drafting the lies that would lead to a formal investigation. All I knew was that I was sitting in my own home, and for the first time in 38 years, I wasn't waiting for permission to be who I was. The phone on the counter remained silent, but my fingers were itching to write. I pulled the notebook toward me, the edges worn from the work I'd put into it. I had been their ghost for a long time, but ghosts don't just haunt the living. Ghosts have a way of revealing the truth, even when the living do everything in their power to bury it. I took a deep breath, the smell of rosemary lingering in the air, and I began to write down the story of the past 3 days. It was a ledger of betrayals, a record of influence, and the first chapter of a process that would ultimately bring the general to his knees. I was Mara Quinn, the daughter who had never been anything, and I was going to show them exactly what that nothing was worth. The weight of history is a heavy thing, especially when that history is written in the blood and disappointment of a family that never learned to look past its own reflection. 6 years before the desert heat of the Joint Readiness Center became my battlefield, I spent my summer leave in a cramped, humid apartment. Nolan was renting in a city 3 states away. He had failed his evaluation, a collapse of discipline that left him staring at a discharge notice with the wide, vacant eyes of a child. I didn't call my father. I didn't send a letter. Instead, I spent 6 weeks stripping away the excuses Nolan had draped over his failures like a cheap coat. I walked him through the manuals, the tactical theory, the dry, agonizing repetition of marksmanship drills, until his hands were calloused and his ego was sufficiently bruised to allow for actual learning. He passed the next assessment with high marks, and I walked away, content to let him believe, and more importantly, to let Everett believe that the golden sun had found his own way back to the light. I had been the ghost in the machine, the silent architect of his success, satisfied that he was back on track. 2 years ago, the pattern repeated, but the stakes had hardened. Nolan was facing a career-ending readiness issue. This time, I didn't offer a summer of my life to save him. I drafted a remediation plan, a document grounded in factual, procedural steps that would allow him the dignity of a second chance, without bypassing the standards I had spent a decade enforcing. I handed him the copy, the official one, and he'd held it like a talisman. He had thanked me then, promising that he would never let his career become the kind of burden that forced me to choose between my ethics and his survival. That memory felt like a ghost of a different life as I stared at the phone screen in my office. Nolan was calling again, his voice tight, with the frantic, jagged energy of someone who had run out of time. "Mara, pick up the phone," he demanded, his tone skipping over the usual pleasantries. "You are ruining everything. Do you have any idea what this is going to do to Dad? To me?" "I'm recused, Nolan," I said, my voice steady, reflecting the calm I'd found in the records I'd spent all morning organizing. "I'm not in the room when those decisions are made. 2 independent teams saw the same failures you're trying to ignore. It isn't personal." "It's always personal with you," he snapped, the sound of glass breaking in the background suggesting he might have knocked something over. "You've been waiting for this. Ever since we were kids, you wanted to be the one who knew the rules, the one who held the power. Well, you have it, and you're using it to burn me down." I thought about the remediation plan I'd written for him 2 years prior, the one he had signed with such genuine, tear-filled gratitude. "I gave you a path to fix this. You chose to ignore it. Now you're asking me to break the law to cover your choices." "Dad already fixed the first review," Nolan shouted, his voice cracking. "Why are you making this one difficult? Call the evaluator, or I'll make sure everyone knows you've been targeting me for years." I held the device away from my ear for a second, listening to the static. The threat was clumsy, born of desperation and the absolute certainty that he could still manipulate the board the way he had manipulated every instructor he'd ever had. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I simply waited until he stopped for a breath. Then I ended the call. I didn't record it, not yet, but I opened the logbook that sat beside my keyboard and wrote down every word, every shift in his tone, every threat. My mother called 20 minutes later. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten, she spoke with a soft, careful rhythm, as if she were guiding me toward a decision that was already made. "Mara, sweetheart, your father is worried," Evelyn said. Her voice was like velvet over gravel. "His heart hasn't been steady since last winter, you know that. The medication, the blood pressure, all of it is flaring up because he feels like his own daughter is attacking the family legacy." "I'm not attacking the family, Mom," I said, looking out at the shimmering horizon. "I'm holding people to the same standard they demand of everyone else." "A family isn't a military board," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We are a unit. We protect each other. If you testify, if you let this investigation move forward, you aren't just hurting Nolan. You are dismantling your father's final years. He's earned his retirement. Do you really want to be the one who denies him that?" I thought about the money I'd sent her, the copays I'd covered, The times I'd rushed to the hospital when the stress she complained about manifested in actual, terrifying cardiac spikes. I had been their shield, their bank, and their silence. And I was tired. "He is responsible for the legacy he leaves behind," I said, my voice cold, detached. "I'm not responsible for his choices, and I'm not responsible for Nolan's." I hung up, and for the first time my hands weren't shaking. The guilt that had shadowed me for years didn't vanish, but it shifted, turning from a crushing weight into a clarity that fueled my next move. I opened my email and began drafting a message to the official ethics contact for the installation. I didn't name names yet, but I laid out the timeline of the pressure I had received, the request to bypass the evaluator, and the clear attempt to influence a personnel action. Denise walked in while I was typing. She brought the scent of fresh rain and ozone with her. She stopped at the doorway, her gaze lingering on the flickering cursor. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low. "Once you send that, there's no coming back. You're not just breaking the dance, Mara. You're setting the stage on fire." "The house is already burning, Denise," I said, not looking up. "I'm just deciding who gets to escape." She didn't try to stop me. She stood there, a silent sentinel in the doorway, while I clicked send. The action felt quiet, almost mundane, but I knew it was the point of no return. I received the voicemail from Nolan that evening. I was sitting in my townhouse, the silence of the room punctuated by the distant sound of wind against the siding. I played it once, my finger hovering over the replay button. "Dad already fixed the first review," Nolan's voice echoed through the speaker, brittle and jagged. "Why are you making this one difficult? Call the evaluator, or I'll make sure everyone knows you've been targeting me for years." I stared at the device. He had said it. He had confirmed everything, not just the interference, but the intent to destroy me if I didn't comply. I backed up the audio, then exported the file to a secure, encrypted folder on my personal drive. I didn't trust the cloud, and I didn't trust the network, so I moved the file to a physical storage device that I kept in the emergency folder, the one that had nothing to do with my father's trust or my mother's pride. Before I shut down the laptop, I checked the office calendar records I had access to as part of my role. I saw the entry made by Major Blake, my father's aide. Quinn Family Readiness Concern. The note was vague, professional, but the timing was precise. It sat directly over the gap in the evaluation timeline, the exact moment the supplementary page had been inserted. I leaned back in my chair, the darkness of the room pressing against the windows. I felt a strange sensation in the center of my chest, not the hollow ache of betrayal, but the cold, sharp precision of a bullet locked in a chamber. I had saved my brother 3 times. I had been his mentor, his savior, and his shield. He hadn't just asked me to break the law. He had asked me to become the ghost that he would eventually blame for his own inadequacies. I thought about my father, sitting in that grand, high-ceilinged office, convinced that his influence was the only law that mattered in the desert. He was a man who had spent his life building a temple of reputation, never realizing that he had built it on a foundation of sand. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours mapping out the next steps, not as a woman seeking revenge, but as a soldier executing a mission. I wasn't going to hack their systems, and I wasn't going to lie to the investigators. I was simply going to allow the system to function the way it was designed to. If the standard mattered as much as they claimed it did, it would do the work for me. At 4 a.m, the wind picked up outside, rattling the window frames like a ghost trying to find its way in. I reached for the notebook and added one final entry to the log, documenting the voicemail and the timeline of the pressure. I was building a case, not just against my brother and his failures, but against the climate of impunity that had defined my father's reign. I sat there until the sun began to bleed across the horizon, turning the desert sky into a bruised, beautiful purple. I felt lighter. The weight of the family name, the duty I had felt toward my mother's fragile health, the obligation to maintain the facade of the Golden family, it was all beginning to dissolve. I wasn't the daughter who needed to fix their mistakes anymore. I was the one who was finally going to let them pay for the consequences they had spent their lives trying to outrun. The voicemail played one last time in my mind. In the background, just before the click of the disconnect, there was a faint, muffled sound, a voice, unmistakable, that belonged to my father, speaking to someone else in the room. "Tell Pike the window closes Friday." I looked at the calendar on the wall. Friday was 2 days away. It was the deadline I had been given, the cutoff point for the manipulation they were desperate to finish. I wasn't scared. I wasn't angry. I was ready. I knew exactly what was coming, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I needed to do to stay on the right side of the standard. The house was burning, and I had already cleared the way to the exit. All that was left was to watch the flames. The formal announcement of an administrative hold felt less like a thunderclap and more like the steady, grinding pressure of an oncoming storm. Major General Ward had locked the range logs, the unit devices, and the physical packet inside the secured preservation facility by the time I reached the command office. He was a man of procedure, and the safety stop had forced his hand into a position where he couldn't simply look away. I stood in the corridor, watching the movement of staff through the glass panels. My assignment to the new training center was officially suspended, now marked with the dreaded pending conduct review status. It didn't happen in an instant, and it didn't feel like a sudden drop. It was the inevitable conclusion to the request Everett had funneled through the personnel office, hours after he knew I had reached out to the Inspector General. Colonel Andrea Shaw arrived the following morning. She was a woman who navigated the military justice system with the surgical precision of someone who had never allowed emotion to cloud a fact. She met me in a quiet room, her notepad open to a clean, crisp page. I didn't offer her narratives. I didn't offer her my opinion on my father's integrity or my brother's competence. I handed her an index of evidence, the dates of the calls, the routing receipts for the recusal memo, the specific emails where Everett demanded a change in the narrative, and the authenticated voicemail Nolan had left on my device. "You kept a meticulous record," Shaw said, her voice devoid of judgment. "In my family, what isn't written down is never said," I replied. It was the truth, as raw and unadorned as the desert landscape outside. She asked for the context of each item, her questions sharp and focused on the timeline of influence. She didn't treat me like a hero or a whistleblower. She treated me like a data point. That was exactly what I wanted. By midday, the news had trickled through the installation. The looks I received in the break room were colder than the desert night. Some of my peers wouldn't meet my gaze, their bodies turning slightly away as I walked past, as if my defiance of the Quinn legacy were contagious. I didn't blame them. They were careerists, and they knew that an association with someone who had challenged a general was a liability they couldn't afford. The digital forensics team began their extraction of the packet metadata around 3 p.m. I was barred from the room, sitting instead in my own workspace, listening to the muffled sounds of the office around me. When Shaw finally returned, her face remained a study in neutral composure. The supplementary page was inserted after the original no-go finding, she confirmed, setting a report on the table. The digital credentials used belonged to Gavin Pike's section, but the timestamp was backdated to suggest it existed before the evaluation. I felt a surge of relief that had nothing to do with personal victory. It was the relief of seeing the lie exposed by the cold, hard logic of the system. And the certification? Captain Quinn signed the final commander certification after the supplementary page was inserted, Shaw noted, watching me closely. He didn't just inherit an error, he validated it. Pike was brought in for questioning shortly after. He emerged an hour later, his confidence replaced by the haggard appearance of a man who realized he was the one holding the bag. He insisted he had only been following the directive to fix clerical issues, but when Shaw asked him about the calendar connection, the direct call from Blake, my father's aide, mere minutes before the packet was reopened, he asked for counsel and stopped speaking. I didn't take joy in his collapse. Pike was a man who had chosen the path of least resistance, and he was now discovering the high cost of that convenience. That evening, I retreated to Denise's house. I couldn't bear to be in my own townhouse, where the silence was beginning to feel like a judgment rather than a sanctuary. Hannah Reed called my personal phone around 8, her voice trembling so violently that I had to ask her to breathe. "Nolan sent a draft statement to every junior officer," Hannah whispered, the sound of her breath hitching. "He wants us to sign it. He wants us to say that no warning regarding the ballistic error was ever issued during the pre-briefing." I felt a flash of cold fury, but I clamped down on it. "Did you sign it, Hannah?" "No, but I'm terrified. He's the commander. He's telling everyone that this whole investigation is just a vendetta, that you're using your ghost call sign to sabotage the unit. Tell them what you saw," I said, my voice quiet and absolute. "Don't sign anything. Don't engage with him directly. Take the statement and bring it to Colonel Shaw immediately. She is the only one who can protect your testimony." I hung up, looking at the dark reflection of the window. Nolan was moving to protect himself, and in doing so, he was documenting his own obstruction of justice. He was the author of his own downfall, and I realized then that I didn't need to do anything more than step aside and let the truth he was trying to bury come to the surface. I wasn't the one sabotaging the unit. Nolan was. He was the one who had written the lie, and he was the one who was forcing his soldiers to validate it. The ghost in the room wasn't me, it was the integrity he had abandoned, now haunting every single piece of paper he had touched. I was simply the witness who had refused to look away. The formal interview with Hannah Reed happened in a secured room, far removed from the prying eyes of the main command building. I remained outside, waiting in the hallway while Colonel Shaw conducted the session. The wait felt like a slow erosion of my patience, a steady thrumming of nerves beneath my skin that I refused to show to the passing officers. When Shaw eventually stepped out, her expression told me nothing, though she did hand me a slim, stapled document without a word. It was a draft statement. The words inside were clinical, designed to erase the warning Hannah had received regarding the unverified ballistic data. At the bottom, the digital properties of the document showed Nolan Quinn as the author, and the phrase "keep the timeline simple" appeared in the notes field. I handed the paper back to her. Nolan's smear campaign accelerated by the end of that afternoon. Family group messages pinged incessantly on my phone, filled with frantic accusations from distant relatives who had been fed a version of events where I had weaponized my call sign to humiliate my own blood. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain the reality of the unit failures to people who preferred the comfort of the family legend. Instead, I saved the messages as evidence, documented the threats to my professional standing, and left the group chat after sending a single final sentence: "Do not contact me about an active review." That evening, I retreated to Denise's townhouse, the only place where I could breathe without the suffocating expectation of performance. We sat at her kitchen table, a modest meal of takeout spread between us. Denise poured wine into glasses that didn't match, her movements steady and comforting. She didn't press for updates, but she watched me with an intuition born of decades of friendship. My emergency folder, the one containing my will, my power of attorney, and the records of the funds I'd carefully sequestered away, sat on the nearby sideboard. I felt a profound sense of relief knowing that, regardless of how this unfolded, my life was my own to hold, not theirs to dismantle. I admitted to Denise that I had paid for Evelyn's medical expenses during the previous winter, a secret I'd kept to maintain the peace, but that I would stop the payments if she continued to weaponize her health for Everett's benefit. Denise just nodded. She knew the cost of helping people who didn't want to be helped. The doorbell rang at 7. I froze, but Evelyn stood on the porch, her face pinched and pale under the porch light. I opened the door just wide enough to block her path. She didn't ask how I was. She asked why her old key didn't work. I didn't offer an excuse. I told her the truth that the boundaries of my home were no longer up for negotiation. She tried to plead, her voice dripping with the familiar guilt of a mother whose own choices had been erased by the system she'd enabled, but I didn't let her inside. I asked if she'd ever considered what it cost Nolan to have his failures erased for him over and over again, but she just looked at me with eyes that refused to see the reality of her own choices. The next day, Nolan tried to justify his actions by telling the board that I had attempted to disqualify him 2 years prior. Shaw immediately pulled the remediation plan from my records, a document I had drafted to give him a legitimate way to retrain rather than facing permanent removal. The signature at the bottom, a genuine, grateful scrawl from Nolan himself, shattered his narrative of the jealous sister. Forensic analysis confirmed that Nolan had authored the draft statement and the cover story long before the official review had even begun. He hadn't panicked, he had prepared. The metadata revealed an earlier version of his draft, one where he had explicitly deleted the reference to the warning I had delivered before the exercise. I stood in the hall later that afternoon, feeling the weight of the evidence pinning him to his own deception. Shaw caught my eye as she walked past, nodding once. My brother had tried to build a wall of lies, but he had done it with his own hands, on his own devices, and he had left the trail clear for anyone who cared to look. The final piece of information arrived just before sunset. Shaw confirmed that the anonymous complaint against me had not originated from anyone within Nolan's unit at all. The electronic signature led directly to a device registered to the office of Lieutenant General Everett Quinn. My father hadn't just been watching. He had been the architect of the attempt to silence me. The ghost in the machine wasn't me, and it was certainly not the standard. It was the man who had believed, until this very moment, that he was the only one who could write the rules. Colonel Shaw sat across from me in the quiet, sterile interview room, her eyes tracing the lines I had drawn across the pages of my notebook. She didn't look for emotions. She looked for the integrity of the timeline. I handed her the evidence index, my hands steady, the routing receipts clipped neatly to the protected communication I had filed weeks earlier. The system was finally moving, but the investigators still lacked the one thing that would make the finding of reprisal undeniable: the evidence that Everett knew about my communication before he moved against me. I knew Major Blake was the missing link. He was the one who managed the general's calendar, the one who handled the office devices, and the one who had been in the room when Everett decided to flex his rank. When Shaw eventually brought him in, I watched from behind the closed door of an observation office. Blake tried to frame the personnel action as his own initiative, a misguided attempt to protect the general from a scandal that might derail his retirement. But Shaw had seen the digital trail. She projected the calendar logs and the device usage records onto the screen, showing Blake that his own computer had been used to initiate the administrative hold on my assignment exactly 19 minutes after he had confirmed to Everett that I had contacted the Inspector General. The hold was verbal, pushed through a frantic phone call to personnel, but the electronic trail showed the system update occurring hours later. Blake crumbled. He admitted he had been the one to whisper the news into Everett's ear, and he had been the one to execute the general's immediate, impulsive command to put me in my place. The most damning piece arrived in the form of a preserved message thread. It was a direct instruction from Everett to Blake, written in the clipped, arrogant shorthand of a man who believed he was untouchable. Once she understands what this can cost her, she will come back into line. I read the words while sitting in the quiet room, and the air seemed to leave my lungs. I didn't cry. My body simply revolted against the long months of repression, and I stepped out into the hallway, leaning against the cold wall while I retched. The mission was complete. The intent was no longer a matter of speculation. I went back inside, composed, and asked Shaw if she needed anything else before I left the building. Evelyn was waiting at the townhouse that evening, her key once again failing to turn in the lock. She looked small, her posture defeated by the heat and the crumbling foundation of the home she'd spent decades maintaining. I opened the door just wide enough to hear her out. She brought an offer from Everett. If I simply termed the complaint a misunderstanding, he would guarantee the restoration of my assignment and protect Nolan's future. "Did you tell him that I asked for the hold to be placed after I reported the pressure?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of the hurt that had once defined our conversations. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze darting away. She admitted that she had forwarded a message. I'd sent her a private message, where I'd confessed my fear of losing the assignment because she believed it would help Everett see that I had a weakness he could exploit to bring me back. She had intended to bridge the gap, but she had merely handed my father the weapon he needed to prove his intent. I looked at her, at the woman who had traded my integrity for the sake of a quiet dinner, and I realized that she had never been a mother so much as she had been a participant in the system I was now dismantling. I felt a hollow, aching resonance, a deep vibration in my chest that had nothing to do with the physical fatigue. It was the sound of a structural failure. Every time I had let her in, I had been reinforcing the very walls that were designed to keep me confined. She stood on the porch, tears carving tracks through the dust on her cheeks, and whispered that Everett had promised Nolan would fall if I testified. I looked at the useless key in her hand, then at the sturdy, locked deadbolt that defined my existence. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent in uniform, standing between the safety of others and the chaos of the world, never realizing that the most dangerous battle was being fought in the kitchen of the woman who raised me. "Then they should both tell the truth," I said, closing the door firmly against the desert night. The latch clicked into place with a definitive, metallic finality. I leaned my forehead against the cool surface of the wood. The wind outside seemed to howl with a new intensity, a wild, scouring sound that swept across the landscape. I knew that tomorrow would bring the formal hearing, a stage where Nolan would finally have to account for his choices, where the documents he signed and the threats he made would be laid bare for the record. I walked to the kitchen and made a cup of tea, the routine of boiling water and waiting for the leaves to steep a welcome anchor in the churning reality of my life. I didn't turn on the lights. The moonlight spilled across the floor, painting the room in shades of charcoal and silver. I opened the logbook one last time. My handwriting was crisp, precise, the entries documenting the timeline of the reprisal now complete. There was nothing left to record regarding the pressure. The evidence was in Shaw's hands, and the system was doing its work. I had spent so long being the daughter who fixed things, the sister who saved things, the soldier who defended things, that I had almost forgotten what it was to simply exist for myself. The silence of the house was no longer a vacuum, but a space filled with the potential of a life I was finally allowed to lead. I thought about the hearing tomorrow, about the way Nolan would look when he realized that his sister wasn't the enemy he'd been told to fight, but the witness who was finally bringing the truth to the light. He would blame me, of course, because blaming me was the only way he knew how to see the world. I went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the house settle. My life had been an endless series of concessions, a slow, quiet surrender to a legacy I had never asked for. But that was over. I had stood my ground, I had kept my records, and I had ensured that when the final accounting arrived, the truth would be there, waiting, exactly where it belonged. The general had believed he could control the outcome by controlling the daughter, but he had underestimated the one thing he had never valued, the standard itself. And tomorrow that standard would be the only judge left in the room. The hearing room was not the dramatic courtroom I had seen in movies. It was a sterile, administrative space, the kind where dreams and careers were dissolved in the fluorescent hum of bureaucratic inevitability. I sat in the hard chair at the back, my hands resting on my knees, watching the back of Nolan's head as he sat with his counsel. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge my presence. and for the first time in my life, that absence of recognition didn't hollow me out. I was a witness, an observer, and a soldier who had long since accepted that my duty was not to the Quinn name, but to the record I had painstakingly built. Nolan's defense was a fragile, desperate structure built on the foundation of his own pride. He spoke with the cadence of a man who believed his words carried the weight of our father's rank, painting a portrait of a sister who was driven by a long-standing, inexplicable resentment, a woman who had used her technical expertise to orchestrate his failure. He focused heavily on the mystery of Ghost 13, portraying my professional specialization as a hidden weapon I'd kept in my pocket for years, waiting for the exact moment to strike. I watched the board members as he spoke. They were senior officers, men and women who had spent their entire lives in the grind of the service. They didn't care about family history. They didn't care about the petty rivalries of siblings. They cared about the readiness packet on the table, the integrity of the data, and the chain of command that had been broken. Their faces remained masks of professional detachment, their eyes tracking the inconsistencies in Nolan's testimony like snipers zeroing in on a target. The two evaluators who had flagged the unit took their seats after Nolan. They were precise, their testimonies devoid of personal bias. They walked the board through the failures and safety protocols and the incomplete ballistic data, their voices steady as they reiterated that my recusal had been processed, filed, and finalized before the final determination was made. They hadn't spoken to me, hadn't received a directive from me, and hadn't been influenced by anything other than the reality of the unit's lack of preparation. They were professionals holding the line, a concept that Nolan, in his arrogance, had assumed was a mere suggestion. When my turn finally came, the air in the room felt thin. I walked to the front, my boots clicking against the linoleum. I didn't look at Nolan. I looked at the board members, one by one. I spoke of the 6 weeks I had spent training my brother years ago, of the remediation plan I had drafted 2 years prior to prevent his permanent disqualification, and of the explicit warnings I had provided before this current validation. Every word I spoke was a tether, anchoring the truth in a room that had been filled with his smoke and mirrors for hours. I did not want him to fail. I told the room, my voice clear and unwavering. I spent years trying to ensure he would succeed. But I reached a point where the standard I served became more important than the family name I carried. That is my responsibility, and I accept it. But the choices Nolan made after my final warning were his alone. He knew the packet was not compliant, and he signed it anyway. I laid the recusal memo on the table, the official record of my detachment from the process. It was a simple piece of paper, yet it carried the weight of my entire career. I was done being the ghost who fixed the machine. I was simply the woman who had documented the breakdown. Nolan called the remediation plan a weapon, a document he claimed I had manufactured to force his subordination. His counsel tried to frame the plan as an ultimatum, an act of psychological manipulation. But then, the board chair asked to see the signature page of that very document. The silence that gripped the room was absolute, a void waiting to be filled with the weight of the past. Nolan's hand had been steady when he signed it, the ink still holding the dark, confident curve of his pride. At the bottom, in his own handwriting, was the note I had almost forgotten. "Thank you for giving me a way back." The board chair read the line aloud, his voice dropping into that rhythmic monotone register that meant a point had been scored for the truth. I watched Nolan's face as he stared at the document, the narrative of the jealous sister crumbling under the weight of his own written gratitude. He had been so sure that I was the villain, so committed to the idea that my life revolved around his existence, that he had forgotten the simple reality of the help he had accepted. He looked suddenly smaller, the bravado of the golden sun slipping away to reveal the man who had traded his honor for the ease of a shortcut. The final piece of the collapse was the voicemail. Shaw gestured to the audio tech, and the recording filled the room, Nolan's voice sounding distorted, smaller, and infinitely more pathetic than I remembered. Dad already fixed the first review. Why are you making this one difficult? Call the evaluator, or I'll make sure everyone knows you've been targeting me for years. Nolan flinched, as if the sound had physically struck him. He tried to claim fixed was merely a misunderstanding, a clumsy shorthand for a clerical correction, but the forensic timeline I had already provided stripped the power from his tongue. The supplementary page had been backdated, and he was the one who had signed off on the final certification. The logic was irrefutable. The evidence was absolute. I sat back in my chair, feeling a profound, terrifying freedom. I had spent so much of my life terrified that my truth would destroy the only world I knew, only to realize that the world had been a cage all along. As the hearing broke for a recess, Nolan cornered me near the vending machines, his face a ruin of anger and dawning panic. He leaned in, his voice a low, jagged whisper that barely reached my ears. He told me that Everett had ordered the personnel branch to put a hold on my assignment before the formal complaint was even logged. He knew, Nolan hissed, his eyes searching my face for a reaction I no longer possessed. He was waiting for you to make a move, and then he was going to break you before you could reach the Inspector General. He told me, she will fold when she sees what I can take. I stared at him, at the man who had been the Golden Sun, the one who had been told he was invincible, and I felt nothing but a quiet, searing pity. He was still trying to use Everett's words to scare me, still trying to anchor his reality to the man who was currently preparing to sacrifice him to save his own reputation. He didn't understand that the General's threats were only as powerful as my willingness to be afraid. He didn't know the first thing about me, Nolan, I said, my voice quiet, and neither did you. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time in years, and I saw the moment the realization hit him. He wasn't the protagonist in this story. He was just another tool that had outlived its usefulness. He was a piece of the Quinn legacy that had become a liability the General was already moving to eliminate. He didn't have long to contemplate the shift in his reality. When he walked back into the room for the final portion of the hearing, he was handed a document by his own counsel, a piece of paper that had leaked from the General's office during the lunch break. It was a draft statement, a document being prepared by Everett's staff, where the General explicitly shifted the blame for the fraudulent evaluation onto the shoulders of Captain Quinn and the evaluation staff. Nolan's name had been placed at the top of the liability list. He was the fall guy. He was the sacrifice. He was the son who had been chosen not to carry the legacy, but to be the shield that burned so the General could keep his own honor clean. I watched as the color drained from his skin, his hands beginning to tremble as he held the paper that would end his career. He looked at me, a desperate, searching look, but I had no comfort to offer. He had built his world on the promise of his father's protection, and now the house of cards had finally caught fire. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I walked out of the room into the harsh golden light of the afternoon, and I felt the hum of the desert wind against my skin. I had done my job. I had provided the record, I had stood by the standard, and I had watched the architecture of their lies collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. I wasn't the ghost anymore. I was simply a soldier, walking away from a war that had been fought in the dark, into a world that I was finally, for the first time, free to name for myself. The General would survive this, perhaps, but the world he had constructed for his children had been reduced to ash, and in that silence, I finally heard the truth of my own voice. Everett entered the hearing room with the practiced, heavy-footed confidence of a man who had commanded the attention of every room he'd walked into for 30 years. He wore his uniform-like armor, the brass buttons catching the harsh overhead light, his posture perfectly rigid. He did not look at Nolan. He did not look at me. He moved directly to the front table, his gaze fixed on the board members with the calm, terrifying expectation of a sovereign appearing before a subordinate court. He began by framing his actions as the standard duties of a general concerned with unit readiness, his tone smooth and unwavering. He denied any direct interference, calling the packet issues clerical, and he dismissed Major Blake as an aide who had been too zealous in his attempts to protect his superior from a distracting, unnecessary investigation. He described me as a daughter with a history of emotional distance, a woman whose professional judgment had been clouded by the friction of our family dynamic. The board members listened, their faces unreadable, but I watched Colonel Shaw's hands. She did not write. She waited. When the floor was finally hers, she did not raise her voice. She simply brought the receipts of the reality we had lived. She presented the preserved call logs, the calendar entries labeled Quinn Family Readiness Concern, and the specific timing of the supplementary page creation that correlated perfectly with the direct pressure exerted on Gavin Pike, who had been sweating through his own hearing earlier, had already admitted under oath that Blake had told him the general expected the matter fixed before Friday. Blake was called next. His testimony was a slow, agonizing dismantling of the general's narrative. Under the weight of the projected evidence, the timestamps, the device logs, and the messages, he confirmed that he had informed Everett about my protected communication to the Inspector General. He explained with a trembling mouth that the personnel action against me had been a direct, reactive strike against my credibility. The room felt suddenly, intensely small. Shaw projected the 19-minute document onto the screen, a stark, factual breakdown, showing how the request for my administrative hold had been pushed to the personnel branch less than 20 minutes after Everett received word of my report. The hold was verbal, pushed through a frantic phone call to personnel, but the electronic trail showed the system update occurring hours later. Blake crumbled. He admitted he had been the one to whisper the news into Everett's ear, and he had been the one to execute the general's immediate, impulsive command to put me in my place. The most damning piece arrived in the form of a preserved message thread. It was a direct instruction from Everett to Blake, written in the clipped, arrogant shorthand of a man who believed he was untouchable. Once she understands what this can cost her, she will come back into line. I read the words while sitting in the quiet room, and the air seemed to leave my lungs. I did not cry. My body simply revolted against the long months of repression, and I stepped out into the hallway, leaning against the cold wall while I retched. The mission was complete. The intent was no longer a matter of speculation. I went back inside, composed, and asked Shaw if she needed anything else before I left the building. Evelyn was waiting at the townhouse that evening, her key once again failing to turn in the lock. She looked small, her posture defeated by the heat and the crumbling foundation of the home she'd spent decades maintaining. I opened the door just wide enough to hear her out. She brought an offer from Everett. If I simply termed the complaint a misunderstanding, he would guarantee the restoration of my assignment and protect Nolan's future. "Did you tell him that I asked for the hold to be placed after I reported the pressure?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of the hurt that had once defined our conversations. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze darting away. She admitted that she had forwarded a message. I'd sent her a private message where I'd confessed my fear of losing the assignment while simultaneously affirming I would not change my testimony. She had intended to bridge the gap, but she had merely handed my father the weapon he needed to prove his intent. I looked at her, at the woman who had traded my integrity for the sake of a quiet dinner, and I realized that she had never been a mother, so much as she had been a participant in the system I was now dismantling. I felt a hollow, aching resonance, a deep vibration in my chest that had nothing to do with the physical fatigue. It was the sound of a structural failure. Every time I had let her in, I had been reinforcing the very walls that were designed to keep me confined. She stood on the porch, tears carving tracks through the dust on her cheeks, and whispered that Everett had promised Nolan would fall if I testified. I looked at the useless key in her hand, then at the sturdy, locked deadbolt that defined my existence. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent in uniform, standing between the safety of others and the chaos of the world, never realizing that the most dangerous battle was being fought in the kitchen of the woman who raised me. Then they should both tell the truth, I said, closing the door firmly against the desert night. The latch clicked into place with a definitive, metallic finality. I leaned my forehead against the cool surface of the wood. The wind outside seemed to howl with a new intensity, a wild, scouring sound that swept across the landscape. I knew that tomorrow would bring the formal hearing, a stage where Nolan would finally have to account for his choices, where the documents he signed and the threats he made would be laid bare for the record. I walked to the kitchen and made a cup of tea, the routine of boiling water and waiting for the leaves to steep a welcome anchor in the churning reality of my life. I did not turn on the lights. The moonlight spilled across the floor, painting the room in shades of charcoal and silver. I opened the logbook one last time. My handwriting was crisp, precise, the entries documenting the timeline of the reprisal now complete. There was nothing left to record regarding the pressure. The evidence was in Shaw's hands, and the system was doing its work. I had spent so long being the daughter who fixed things, the sister who saved things, the soldier who defended things, that I had almost forgotten what it was to simply exist for myself. The silence of the house was no longer a vacuum, but a space filled with the potential of a life I was finally allowed to lead. I thought about the hearing tomorrow, about the way Nolan would look when he realized that his sister was not the enemy he'd been told to fight, but the witness who was finally bringing the truth to the light. He would blame me, of course, because blaming me was the only way he knew how to see the world. I went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the house settle. My life had been an endless series of concessions, a slow, quiet surrender to a legacy I had never asked for. But that was over. I had stood my ground, I had kept my records, and I had ensured that when the final accounting arrived, the truth would be there, waiting, exactly where it belonged. The general had believed he could control the outcome by controlling the daughter, but he had underestimated the one thing he had never valued, the standard itself. And tomorrow, that standard would be the only judge left in the room, and I would be free to walk away. I laid back, the weight of the years beginning to lift, replaced by the steady, rhythmic breathing of a woman who had finally reclaimed her name. I was Mara Quinn, the master sergeant who had refused to play the ghost, and for the first time in my life, the future didn't belong to them. It belonged to the silence, to the truth, and to the soldier who had finally come home to herself. I stared into the dark, watching the shadows retreat, knowing that the morning would bring the end of the only world I had ever known and the beginning of everything else. The general could hold on to his fading legacy, and Nolan could hold on to his shattered pride, but they could no longer hold on to me. The ledger was closed, the accounts were settled, and I was finally, truly breathing on my own terms. I closed my eyes, the rhythm of the desert night lulling me into a rest that was earned, not given. Tomorrow was coming, and for the first time, I was ready to greet it as myself. The command issued the relief orders during a gray, suffocating morning, the kind where the desert sky looked like polished lead, heavy and pressed against the earth, as if the atmosphere itself were tired of holding up the sun. Everett Quinn was removed from his role concerning readiness, reassigned to a status pending final disposition, his career dismantled not by a sudden, theatrical stroke of lightning, but by the relentless, quiet, and methodical accumulation of evidence that made his position untenable. The board findings substantiated the allegations of improper influence, abuse of authority, and reprisal, setting in motion an adverse memorandum and a retirement grade review that would strip away the remaining veneer of his professional life. Peace, by excruciating peace. I watched from a distance as he cleaned his office, his movements stiff, his shoulders bowed under the weight of a reality he had spent years attempting to deny, a man hollowed out by the very system he had once thought he could command. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic escorts from the base to satisfy the public appetite for a scandal. There was only the absolute bone, deep silence of the staff as he walked through the halls, a silence that felt heavier than any shout and more permanent than any disgrace. Nolan's fall mirrored the collapse of the structure he had so desperately and foolishly tried to protect, his own arrogance serving as the final hammer blow. He was relieved of his command. The unit validation was formally rescinded, and he was required to undergo a full reevaluation under new, impartial leadership that would not be swayed by the prestige of a name. A relief for cause evaluation was initiated, marking his personnel file with the kind of stain that effectively ended any hope of career advancement, while the evidence regarding his false certification and witness pressure was transferred to legal review for the subsequent administrative proceedings. His wife moved out of the guest house that afternoon, her departure quiet, deliberate, and final after the discovery of how deep his lies had truly run, leaving him alone in a space that had been intended for the prestige of the Quinn name, a name that now tasted like ash in the mouths of everyone who spoke it. Hannah Reed was transferred out of his chain of command, protected from further retaliation and free to move forward without the burden of the false statement Nolan had tried to force upon her, her survival a small but significant victory in the middle of the wreckage. The enablers did not escape the tide, though their fates lacked the tragic finality of the family collapse. Gavin Pike was removed from his evaluation duties and received his own adverse administrative action. A man who had traded his integrity for a shortcut that led him directly into ruin, his reputation shattered by the very hands he had sought to please. Major Blake lost his position and had his promotion recommendation rescinded, though he received a modicum of leniency for his role in providing the testimony that cemented the case against Everett, a betrayal that served as a final, pathetic plea for survival. A subordinate commander was forced to draft a corrective action plan to address the command climate issues that had allowed such influence to fester, a necessary, clinical step that did not feel like justice so much as it felt like cleaning a wound that had been left to rot for too long, a necessary sanitation of the system. My restoration was not a parade, nor was it a return to the status quo, for there was no status quo to return to after the foundation had been scrubbed clean. The complaint against me was officially declared unsubstantiated, and the personnel action was formally categorized as a clear case of reprisal, a label that felt like the closing of a book that had been too difficult to read. When my assignment was finally restored, I insisted on a condition that caught the command off guard. I refused to accept the new role as a form of compensation or apology. I requested that the selection process be revalidated by an independent board, an act that felt less like defiance and more like a return to the very standard I had been fighting to protect, a refusal to let them treat my career as a bargaining chip for their peace of mind. When the independent board reaffirmed the selection, Major General Ward told me that I wasn't being rewarded for being Ghost 13, but for protecting the standard even when it cost me everything I had spent years building, a recognition that did not heal the wounds but at least acknowledged the struggle. Everett encountered me in the corridor near the command building, his uniform stripped of the insignias of his former rank, his face pale and etched with lines I hadn't noticed before, the ghost of the man who had terrified me for 30 years, suddenly appearing like a stranger. He looked at me, a flicker of something that might have been regret crossing his eyes, though it quickly curdled into the familiar defensive resentment that had always been his default state of being. He told me that everything he had built for our family would vanish because of my testimony. His voice a brittle, thin echo of his former power, a pathetic attempt to lay the blame for his collapse at my feet. It will disappear, because it was built on everyone else cleaning up after you, I said, my voice steady, reflecting the months of work it had taken to strip away the fear he had once held over me, a realization that had finally freed me from the weight of his legacy. I am still your father, he said, a desperate, final attempt to reclaim the hierarchy that had defined my life, a hierarchy that no longer had a place for me. "That was your responsibility," I replied, not breaking eye contact, the words landing with a finality that made him look away. "Not your immunity." He didn't apologize, and he didn't offer a hand. He simply asked if I would be attending his retirement ceremony, a question that hung in the air like a ghost of a life that no longer existed, a question that belonged to a version of me that had died in that hearing room. I didn't answer him then, but I knew, in the cold, clear space where my choices lived, that the ceremony was for a man who had long since ceased to be the father I had once desperately needed, and I had no intention of mourning the loss of a myth. Evelyn sent me a draft speech that evening, a text she hoped I would read at the event, where Everett intended to publicly apologize for his lapses, a document that reeked of the same manipulation that had governed our lives. As I read the words on the screen, I felt a familiar, sharp pang of pity, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, precise analysis of the document. He was calling the scandal a family misunderstanding, blaming the falsification on Nolan's youthful exuberance, and praising himself for protecting his children, framing his corruption as a form of misguided fatherly love, a narrative that had been carefully curated to protect the only thing he had ever truly cared about, his own name. He was rewriting the story as he had always done, ensuring that his legacy remained intact even as the world watched it crumble, a final, desperate act of theatrical control. I looked at my calendar for the coming Saturday. I had 2 commitments. One was the retirement ceremony, a stage where the old story would be told one final time to a room full of people who preferred the comfort of the lie over the jagged, difficult edge of the truth. The other was the first day I would stand at the front of a classroom at the Standardization Center, where I would be responsible for teaching the next generation that the standard was not a suggestion, but the very marrow of our service. I knew which choice would satisfy them, and I knew which choice would finally satisfy the part of me that had been waiting 38 years to stand upright. On Saturday morning, Mara put on her uniform, buttoned her collar, and drove toward the base gate. The morning light sharp against the windshield, a new beginning etched into the very air she breathed, as if the world itself were resetting after a long, dark, and exhausting storm. She didn't say which way the car turned, only that she was finally the one behind the wheel, navigating a path that belonged to nobody but her, a trajectory defined not by the expectations of the Quinn legacy, but by the steady, unyielding compass of her own conscience. The silence of the morning wasn't empty. It was the sound of a woman who had finally learned the difference between the legacy she had been given and the life she had chosen to live, a life built on the solid ground of her own decisions rather than the shifting sands of her father's influence. The ceremony would go on without her. The speech would be delivered to empty ears, and the truth would remain, silent and immutable, written into the official record where no amount of manipulation could ever erase it again, a permanent testament to the cost of the lie. She was finally home, not in the house she had bought or the townhouse she had furnished, but in the skin she had spent a lifetime earning, a territory that was entirely, irrevocably, and beautifully her own. The long, slow war was over, and as the car merged onto the base road, she felt the simple, profound peace of knowing that whatever happened next, it would be her own story, told in her own words, and centered on the only thing that had ever mattered, the truth that existed outside of the shadows of the general and his golden sun. The steering wheel felt steady beneath my hands, a simple, tactile reminder of the control I had finally reclaimed. I reached the intersection where the base road split, the left lane leading toward the grand hall where the retirement ceremony was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, and the right lane winding toward the Standardization Center, where a group of young, eager soldiers awaited their first day of instruction. The choice was not a struggle. It was a clarity that had been gathering in my chest for over a year. I turned right. The training center was a utilitarian structure, smelling of fresh paint, industrial cleaner, and the dry, pervasive scent of the desert floor. Inside the main classroom, chairs were arranged in irregular rows, their mismatched frames a testament to the limited budget the cell had been granted. On the front wall, a simple plaque had been mounted, its surface still bearing the faint marks of the installation. It read, "No rank outranks the standard." I opened the session with a case study I had prepared, a fictionalized but agonizingly accurate scenario regarding conflict of interest in the evaluation process. I did not mention the Quinn family, and I did not reference the scandal that had shattered the general's career. I focused on the mechanics of integrity, the way small, seemingly insignificant compromises in documentation could lead to systemic failures that threatened lives on the ground. When a young lieutenant raised his hand to ask why the recusal process had to be documented so thoroughly when professional trust should be sufficient, I looked at him, my expression neutral, and told him the truth that had defined the most difficult year of my life, because the standard only matters when it applies to the people we love. Through the classroom window, I could see the maintenance crew moving toward the older training wing of the center, their tools glinting in the morning light. They were working to remove the nameplate that had once honored my father in the halls of the facility, a task they treated with the same bureaucratic efficiency they would have applied to any other routine maintenance. No one cheered. No one protested. The brass plaque, tarnished by years of neglect and misuse, was simply unbolted, wrapped in heavy, protective plastic, and carried away like a discarded artifact. It was an ending devoid of the theatrical weight I had once feared, a simple, necessary pruning of the past. Nolan was waiting for me in the parking lot after the class had concluded, his presence a jarring intrusion into the clean, purposeful rhythm of my new life. He wore civilian clothes, the absence of his uniform making him look smaller, stripped of the rank he had worn like a costume. The legal proceedings had concluded, and he was officially out of the service, the finality of the decision hanging in the air between us like the dust that coated our boots. "You could have warned me," Nolan said, his voice stripped of the command authority he had once wielded so poorly. "I did," I reminded him, my voice detached, a ghost of the sister who had spent years trying to keep him from the edge. 3 times. He argued that our father had promised to handle the situation, that the general had convinced him the system would bend in their favor. I looked at him, realizing he still believed that the world was governed by promises made in private rooms rather than the cold, unyielding reality of the records he had personally signed. "That was the problem," I said, looking past him to the horizon, where the mountains rose like silent, judgment-filled peaks. "You stopped believing consequences applied to you, and you stopped believing that you had to be the one to earn your way," he asked, with a sudden, flickering hope that made my stomach churn. If there was any chance for forgiveness, any hope of restoring the life he had built upon his father's reputation. I told him that forgiveness did not mean the restoration of a command he had lost, and it certainly did not mean a return to the power he had once used to force his way into my life. Forgiveness was a private, internal state, and it had nothing to do with the fact that he was no longer a person I could trust. Evelyn called again after the retirement ceremony, which had been a hollow, diminished affair, attended by a handful of staff, who had little choice but to be there, her voice thick with the reality of an empty house. She told me Everett was furious, pouring his resentment onto Nolan, and that Nolan, in turn, was turning his bitterness back toward the house itself. She asked, with a desperate, familiar hope, if she could stay at my townhouse for a few days to find some respite from the decay of their marriage. I told her no, gently but with a finality that left no room for negotiation. She had her friends, her counselor, and the life she had chosen to curate, but my townhouse was not a sanctuary for the remnants of a system she had helped to maintain. She cried, a high, thin sound that had once been the signal for me to abandon everything to help her, but this time The sound faded into the background, a reminder that I was no longer the one responsible for the architecture of her unhappiness. I hung up, and the silence in the townhouse was absolute, a perfect, clean slate. 2 months later, in July of 26, the atmosphere felt different, the air less charged with the threat of inevitable collapse. It was the first time since day zero that I felt truly settled into the skin I was wearing, a master sergeant who had survived the war and found a way to start living in the aftermath. I sat at the table with Denise, Hannah, and a few other friends, the meal simple, the mood lightened by the lack of expectation. We weren't celebrating a conquest or a grand revenge. We were just sitting, talking about the next day's lesson plans, repairing a wobbly chair with a spare shim, enjoying the basic, quiet dignity of a life that belonged entirely to us. I walked to the sideboard where the notebook sat, its pages full of the logs and the records that had once been my only protection. I didn't burn them, for they were the truth, and the truth had a right to exist, but I placed the book inside the drawer and closed it, locking away the ghosts of the past. I wouldn't need to consult those pages anymore, for the record was already in the official files, a permanent mark on the history of the center, and I was done living in the defensive crouch of a soldier waiting for the next strike. The email confirming the permanent, adverse findings against Everett was still there, a digital timestamp of a war that had finally reached its conclusion, and I felt nothing but a distant, analytical satisfaction as I moved the correspondence to the archive folder. The revenge I had sought wasn't the public humiliation of the general or the dramatic fall of the Golden Sun. It was the simple, beautiful fact that I was still standing. I had refused to allow their failures to define my future, and I had refused to let their name become the weight that held me under the surface of my own potential. I had not used the scandal to build a new career, and I had not allowed the name Ghost 13 to become a commercial product or a badge of honor to be paraded around. The work was enough. The teaching was enough. And this was the part that surprised me the most. The quiet was enough. Later that evening, the phone buzzed against the surface of the table, the light illuminating the room for a fleeting moment. It was a final message from Evelyn. "When I am ready to tell the whole truth without asking you to fix it, may I call?" I didn't reach for the device immediately. I didn't need to prove I was in control, and I didn't need to signal my forgiveness to someone who still struggled to understand the question. I looked around the room at the people who had chosen to be there, not because they had to, but because they cared. I thought about the man who had been my father, about the years he had spent shouting that I was nothing, and the years I had spent believing him because the echo of his voice was louder than my own. I realized then that the general had been wrong about everything, not just the readiness packet or the standard, but about the fundamental nature of the daughter he had tried to silence. I had never been nothing. I had simply stopped needing him to name what I was, and in that realization, I had finally become the only thing that mattered. I stood up, walked over to the table, and turned the phone face down, its screen dimming until it matched the deep, comforting shadow of the room. The future was open, a vast and terrifying blank space that I was ready to fill with my own handwriting. I wasn't the daughter of the Quinn family, and I wasn't the instrument of the Quinn legacy. I was simply Mara, a woman who had walked through the fire, emerged on the other side, and realized that the standard I had protected was the very thing that had saved me from the emptiness of their world. I looked at Denise, who was laughing at something Hannah had said, and I felt the solid, warm reality of a life that was finally entirely my own. The war had cost me the family I thought I needed, but it had granted me the family I truly deserved. And as I took my seat back at the table, I knew that for the first time in 38 years, I was perfectly, entirely, and wonderfully home. You have spent your entire life believing that the value of your existence is tied to the approval of those who hold the power to name you. Perhaps you have spent decades standing in the shadows of someone else's legacy, constantly correcting their mistakes and silencing your own needs to preserve a version of family that only ever existed in the stories you were told. You have learned, through the long and agonizing process of holding the line, that the most painful battle is not the one you fight against the system, but the one you fight against the quiet, persistent voice inside you that demands you be the one to save everyone. You must understand that your integrity is not a bargaining chip, and your silence is not a currency you should pay to buy the affection of people who would sacrifice your stability the moment it becomes inconvenient for their own reputations. When you finally decide to walk away from a role that requires you to abandon your own truth, you are not failing your family. You are setting the only standard that truly matters, the one that refuses to bend simply because someone else has a title or a history of demanding your compliance. Realize that the weight of someone else's expectation is not a burden you are required to carry, and you have every right to reclaim the space, the time, and the dignity that you have been handing away for years. It is a terrifying realization that your life is your own, but it is also the only path to a peace that cannot be gifted to you by those who never learned how to offer it in the first place. You do not need to be the ghost in the machine of someone else's life to justify your worth, and you certainly do not need to wait for their permission to stop fixing the cracks they refuse to acknowledge. If you look back at the roles you have played and realize that the person you were trying to protect was never truly looking out for you, are you ready to finally step out of their shadow and trust the strength of the standard you have been holding all along? What is the one truth you have been keeping in the dark? And what would your life look like if you finally allowed yourself the courage to speak it out loud to the people who rely on your silence?